At this point, I'm just following these lights. I see as I'm coming into this corner, I see my first brake zone. Boom, 300. I get out of the throttle and I just coast into the brake zone because I don't want to run into the back of somebody. It's give and take in these conditions. You can't force the issue. If you force the issue, you're going to run into the back of somebody and you're going to get penalized. And it's just, it is what it is. Looking out my peripheral, I see my brake zones. Trying to find grip. Go through the puddle, lose a little bit of time. But driving in conditions like this is more driving with instinct, adapting, improvising to what the track gives you. Every lap's going to be different. And the drivers that drive best are the ones that have really good car control, put themselves in good spots. If a mistake happens or if a loss of grip happens, they're not going to go off track. They're just going to slide a little bit, but they'll still have plenty of room to be able to catch it. Knowing where those losses of grips are going to happen, and being ready for it, and not making mistakes. And if you do that in the low grip conditions, you're going to be successful. The lap times for this session, starting with really, really wet, started in the 207s, and it was pretty consistent. 207, 207, 207, 207, 207. And then they started to fall. As the rain stopped, it took about, with 30 cars rolling around, it took about, I want to say, 13 to 15 minutes before a definitive dry line formed. And if we go to where my fast lap was and we go to the far chase camera, you can actually see the dry line. So as we're driving along, look at the dry line formed. You can see, not through the corners necessarily, but through the straights where everybody's on the same line, you can see the lighter portions of the track. That's where it's dry, especially through this corner coming up. You can see the dry line through here. Coming up here, look at the dry line. Where he is, he's right on the dry line through here. You can see it all the way through the corner. That's the line we want to drive. We want to put our car there. We want to make sure our loaded tires are in that dry line to take advantage of the grip that it has to offer. And the result is I'm driving on the same tire in the same car. In 14 laps, I'm driving, or I'd say, where's my last 207? So in 9 laps, I'm driving almost 8 seconds faster a lap, just because of the drying line and the conditions changing.
So when would you switch to slicks?
Ah, the $1 million question.
That's the question.
When do you switch to slicks? Well, here, let me ask a question. Based on what you see here, and you see with this dry line forming as I'm driving, and going 8 seconds faster, would you switch to slicks right now?
Well, on this track, to me, it's super tricky because of what the corners you just went through. That's going to be crazy with slicks, and then this whole section coming up is very difficult with slicks. So, do you gain enough to actually go to slicks? I mean, I don't know.
So that's the $1 million question: is when do you go to slicks, and when can you get away with it, and is it going to hamper you? Because ultimately, what you're looking for, there's a crossover point where the lap time that you're driving on wets and slicks will be the same, and that's when you should be on slicks. But you should be on slicks when that crossover point happens. And when that crossover point happens, every lap after that you're not on slicks, you're going to lose time to somebody that went on slicks.
The other problem is even if you're faster and you run up on somebody, you can't get off the dry line. So what are you going to do?
That's a great point. We're driving on a dry line, or we're using the dry line to as best of our abilities to get our speed. If we go to make a pass on somebody, like I think I do on this guy here in a second, he just came out of pits, you're going to be in a wet track. So the grip is going to disappear. So the grip that you're used to vanishes. Like right here. See, I got in there. I got into the wet. I understeered out because I wasn't on the dry line, and then I ended up hitting him. So making passes is very difficult when there's an actual dry line forming, and you have to know where it's going to happen and be prepared for it. But the reason I asked that question is because I tried to go on slicks. And this was the result.
There you go.
So again, driving on the dry line. I'm on slicks right now. I've done one out lap. It was terrifying. This guy is obviously on wets. Everybody's still on wets. But look how much slower I am. I've got no mid-corner grip. The car is wiggling. I'm in traction control like crazy. It is just not a fun experience. But look at the distance he pulled on it. It's too early to go on slicks. The lap time kind of spoils the plot. I did a 2:17, so I was, 15 seconds slower than on wet tires. It's too early. Here's my general rule of thumb of when you go on slicks, when you don't. And I'm going to put some while we talk. I'm going to make it nice and pretty. All right, so when to go slicks and when not. The nice thing about the Porsche and a lot of the GT3 cars is there's actually tire pressures on the dashboard. If you haven't seen them, they're on the dashboard down in the middle. So if I go to cockpit and I take this away, it's down there in the middle. So underneath the gear change or the gear, it says tire, and you've got all four corners. And I have it in imperial units, so the big number is PSI. The even larger number but smaller font is tire temperature. But PSI is what I'm focused in. As you drive, your cold temps when you come out on tires is going to be somewhere in the 24s if you're an Imperial. I don't know what it is in bar, but I'm guessing it's like low ones for bar. As you drive and as the weather and as the wetness evaporates off the track and dryness starts to form, you're going to start sliding those wet tires on the track, and they're going to start to heat up. They're going to heat up really quick. And so the pressure is going to increase. There's an ideal pressure about, I've found about high 26 PSIs to 27 PSI that a wet tire really likes and is its fastest. If you start going into the high 27s and start tickling 28 PSIs, you're outside the envelope in terms of pressures on the wet tire, and it's going to feel really greasy. It's almost going to feel like a wet track again, where you can't put the power down, you're sliding all over the place, and you'll be scratching your head like, why is that happening? The track's only getting drier. I should have only more grip. Well, yeah, you're on a wet tire on a drying track, and you're overdriving the car. When I find that the tire is getting into the 28 PSI range, I really should start considering getting on slicks. Because at that point, I've kind of met that cross of slick is going to be better for this state of track. It's not going to be bolt on the slicks and go 100% like I would on a dry track. There's still going to be danger areas. But that slick is going to be as fast as that wet tire, if not better. And only going to get better from there, depending on the forecast. So that's...
Even on this track with those tricky corners, because it's those tricky two sections that take forever to dry out.
Yes, even with those, because you will
able to.
You will make so much time up on the dry corners that those wet corners, even if you have to tiptoe through them, will not make it slower. Let's put it this way: when you get on, I think a dry racetrack on slicks here at Imola, a lap time is something in the, I think it's the low 40, like a 43 or a 44 is really scooting.
41 or
right?
something. Yeah.
So even if you give up 5 seconds in the slow corners, you're still going to be in the upper 40s, right? Wet tire is not going to get anywhere close to that. A wet tire's best performance on a dry track would be mid 50s maybe, and you're going to be cooking that tire. It's going to be hard to drive that fast. So even if you have to stop in those corners, you will make up so much more time everywhere else that anybody staying on wets for those dangerous areas, you're going to, even if you stop through those corners, they're never going to catch you because you're going to be miles down the road by the time you get there.
Well, it's just such a unique track transitioning because of those couple of complexes. A lot of tracks the line will form pretty much all the way around, but that one section will stay wet for an hour. It's not going to dry out in an hour. I know that.
The other thing I would say, so that's the way I determine when I go to slicks, is based on the tire pressures in the car and how the car is feeling. The other way is if you've got crew chief, or not crew chief, if you've got the spotter, the iRacing spotter, a really safe way to do it is based on what he says and how he declares the race. So
Oh,
if you are going from dry to wet, the spotter will say it has been declared a wet race. You should be on wet tires when he says that. If you are going from wet to dry, if the spotter says it has been declared a dry race, you should be on dry tires. You could probably get away being on dry tires maybe a lap or two earlier before he says that. But when he says you can be on dry or it's a dry race, you need to be pitting that lap and bolting on the slicks.
Chris,
So that's the easy way to determine if you're not comfortable with the pressures thing.
Chris, is there a reason why you use pressures, tire pressures, instead of just tire temps? Considering, I guess, one's a derivative of the other. Just curious about that.
Yeah, so the temperature is going to fluctuate pretty heavily as you drive. So if you drive through a puddle, your temperature is going to come down pretty quick. And then as you brake, it's going to kind of spike again. It's going to kind of come. So it's going to have more variance in it. Tire pressure is kind of like inside the tire. So it is keeping, it's kind of keeping a more even keel as opposed to kind of spiking and going up and down. So if you go off temp, you can go off temp. But again, temp is off the surface of the tire. Pressure is off the heat in the tire itself. So that's why I like pressure better.
Yeah, like,
Yeah, and that's basically it. But like I said, you can go either one. But it's a derivative. At the end of the day, even if you had a really, really hot tire temp, now obviously the material in the tire has a ideal temperature it wants to be to maintain its actual surface stickiness, for lack of a better word. Its operating temperature, like if it is boiling, it's not going to be as good as possible. But in terms of the actual contact patch with the road, which is what we're really concerned about, frankly, tire pressure is dictating the size of that contact patch. And if you go too high on the temp, you're starting to balloon the tire, and your contact patch is actually physically getting smaller because you have too much pressure in the tire. And so your contact patch may be my palm, and then as you get more and more pressure, the sidewalls are going to start to come up, and you're going to start to shrink that contact patch, and that's where your loss of grip is because there's too much pressure in the tire. So that's the important thing, is keep those tire pressures in the envelope that work. If you go too high, you're losing your contact patch, and that's where it's going to start to feel greasy. In real life, we're concerned with high and low temps. iRacing, unfortunately, they don't model the carcass of the tire, so low pressures tend to be better. So that's why when you go out and you start driving, you can just go out and run as hard as you can, because normally in real life, if you have no tire pressure in your tire, or it's cold, and you start sliding that tire across the surface of the road, or you start hitting curbs, you can damage the sidewall and you can rip the carcass of the tire because there's just no pressure. It's just as you're dragging a limp tire across a coarse surface, and it's just going to claw at the tire. iRacing doesn't model that, so that's why you push right out of pit lane. But if we were concerned about it, we would bring the tires in. The other thing you can do, but I haven't really had too much success, is if you are finding yourself your tire pressure is getting too high, when you're driving on the straight, drive off the racing line, and try to drive where there's more wetness to try to cool the tires off. It works. It can bring the pressures down a little bit, but it's a really extreme situation where, like, say you're knocking on the door of 28 psi and you're searching for puddles to try to keep trying to keep them as cool because you're trying to make it to the end of the race or something like that. It can help, but it can be difficult.
Hey, Chris, kind of a follow-on to that is, I mean, ideally, if that crossover point is within your fuel tank, you're going to want to try to time, your pit in to get more fuel to finish the race with a tire switch. Is there a scenario where it makes any sense after you've exhausted your entire fuel cell and you've gone back out on wets because it's still not quite there, but the crossover point happens after you pit? I mean, this is the calculation that's hurting my brain. It's like, at what point does it not make sense to come in and switch tires again? You understand what I'm saying?
Well, let's put it this way. I think, so if you do a pit stop for tires are going to take about, I think it's 28 seconds, but let's just call it 30 seconds. And then pit lane is usually about 20 seconds. So let's call it 50 seconds to go get a new set of boots for the car. a dry tire on a track that is pretty much dry or has some wet spots, let's say 145 for ease of math, right? And let's say a wet tire driving as hard as it can on a dry track on the same track is going to be doing 155s. So that means 5 laps will be the crossover point in terms of not getting tires and getting tires. So if you're out there driving more than 5 laps, then the slicks are going to be quicker, even if you come in again. It gets worse if it's really like your dry or your wet tires are really, really hot and you've got no speed in them and you're running 2-minute lap times and you're on a dry track and slicks are doing 145s, you're 15 seconds. So that's going to be 30. So that's going to be in 4 laps or 3.5 laps. The slick will have the guy that pitted, if he was on your butt, if he pits, puts slicks on, goes back out, he will catch you in like 3.5 laps. If you've got less than 3.5 laps left in the race, then it may make sense to just stay out and deal with the slow tires. If you got 4 laps in or 5 laps left of the race, you should come down and get slicks. That's why it's so like when you watch races in real life and you see these guys come in, like Formula One, if you watch the Australia race, those guys came in and took slicks. Everybody came in and took slicks. Even if it looked like it was only going to be dry or a slick race, a dry race for a few laps, they still came in, bolted new tires on, and went back out. And the reason they did that was because those few laps that they're running on the dry tire are so much faster than running on the wet tire that it eats up the pit lane delta. So those are the kind of thoughts you need to have in play. But you make a mistake and you go out there on slicks and it's still too wet to be on slicks, and well, that's a double whammy, right? That's even worse. So
All right, just something. Well, maybe I cannot remember on fixed setups. Can you adjust your traction control at all?
yeah, so let's talk about fixed setups. For those of you that are in challenge and sport, the only thing you can change on a fixed setup is brake bias. So that's it. You can't change your traction control. However, for this race, it's only going to get wetter. So it's going to be a wet setup. So you don't really have to worry about. You're gonna be on a setup that's designed to be on wet tires, and it's only going to get worse from there. So you're not going to have to worry about a drying track. So yeah, but the only thing you can change in a fixed setup is your brake bias. For pro and club on a drying track, the world is your oyster on setups. You can do whatever you want. Switching from wet tires to dry tires, if that makes sense, you can also make changes to your car in the pit stop, including changing sway bars. They made that. That's a relatively new feature on iRacing, and it's in your black box, just like you would for changing tires. It's just further down. I think it's like F10 if you haven't messed with your black box numbers, but it's deep in the black boxes, like past the radio for car setup. You can actually soften and firm up your sway bars to change the balance of the car during the pit stop. If you're taking tires, the sway bars, I think, will take another 5 seconds if you make a sway bar change, 5 to 7 seconds. So for me personally, I'm not going to change anything on the car because that's a significant amount of time that I'm just sitting there. I would just drive the setup on slick tires, frankly. But you can make those changes. If you are an open setup, you can also change your traction control. So as the track starts to dry out and there's more grip, you can relax traction control to allow more slip angle in the car before it starts to get in. So yeah, those are the changes that you can make. Fixed setup versus open setup.
So I guess maybe the last question I have is, when do you quit gripping the steering wheel so hard from going back and forth and trying to hold control? I mean, is there a point for that?
The best drivers actually relax when they drive in the wet. Frankly,
Yeah, we're talking about me, not the best drivers.
So, but that's the key. Like it's hard not to white knuckle. You want to white knuckle. It's really difficult not to white knuckle. But you have to try to work as best as you can. And one of the things I do, and it makes me feel a little dainty, is when I'm driving, I sometimes keep my pinkies outside the wheel and just drive with like these two fingers, and just kind of try to keep a very force myself to keep my hands from being death grips. So
We want a
elegant
video of that.
drive like that. Well, you're trying to feel all the feel of the car. Now, if
I
you've
get
got
it, I get it.
if you've got a ton of force feedback in your car, like the force feedback in your wheel is really high, you can't do that. It's going to rip the wheel out of your hands. I don't.
Yeah.
Any car,
Tries to break my fingers.
yeah, any race car you drive, unless you don't have power steering, and you're like in a Miata or a prototype or something, actually it doesn't have a lot of force feedback in it. Like the cup car I drive is relatively light, so you can drive it with two fingers and still be okay. But I do it to try to especially down the straights, just to try to force myself not to death grip the wheel, because it's so easy to do. I'm trying to look at... Okay, one more thing I wanted to show, and it just as an example. Happens to everybody. So, drying track, I think it's this lap. Here's the problem that can happen. You get comfortable with the drying track, you try to make a pass on somebody, and you outbrake yourself. It happens to me too. So here I am coming up on 3 cars. I'm going to come around this outside car. He's going to brake a lot earlier because he's right behind somebody, and it puts me out. And now I'm trying to avoid him. I'm trying to avoid him. And I drift out into him and spin as a result. It wasn't because I was like, I'm going to pass this guy. This is my move. I'm way too far behind, frankly, at this point to try to make a move on this guy. But what happened was I was getting too comfortable with the conditions in the car and how it was performing, that I ignored his braking, which he's braking right here, and I substituted my braking. And so by the time I saw his brake lights come on, I'm on the brakes now. I've got my ABS lights fully illuminated, so I'm kind of in panic mode stop here. And then I go to the inside because I don't want to hit him. Now, I was able to hold it, but ultimately I'm kind of out of control. I'm up on the curb. I'm in the wet stuff, and I kind of understeer out into the side of him, and I ended up spinning as a result. That's why it's so important to always be aware of your surroundings. Don't get comfortable, especially on wet tracks, and understand that as soon as you go offline, you're on a damp track or a wet track, and the grip disappears, and it makes it really difficult and really easy to outbrake yourself and go into the back of someone or go into the side of someone if you're not paying attention, or you're
This little
turn your
straight
brain off.
right there, isn't it a little downhill? So in the rain, it makes it really kind of tricky to brake.
It's downhill. All the really slick stuff's out here, and in fact, you've got a lot of grip on the inside. That's why I was still able to make it work. Like, I stopped the car before the corner, right? I'm still turning for the corner here. So I still was able to make the corner work. But there's a car on my outside, and I drifted to him. And so ultimately we're racing with other cars. If you can make the turn work, it doesn't matter if you still run into the side of someone, right? So it's just things to keep in mind. And if that were to be, if PCA were to judge that would totally be on me. Yeah, I'm ahead of him right here, but I'm offline. I'm slightly out of control. I hit his side of his door and I spin. So he wouldn't get a penalty for that. He's just driving his normal line. So, so be aware. There's something I call the reptilian brain, right? If you are driving along and you are in spray, you can't see anything, you know you're coming up to a really hard corner, that reptilian brain in your head should be coming up and saying, maybe we shouldn't be in this situation right now. This is dangerous. Lift. Get out of the throttle, let the car start to slow down a little bit, give yourself a little bit of room to the car in front of you so you can see what's going on. Get on the brakes nice and smooth. Be controlled, and wait for a circumstance that's not that scariness. Your reptile part of the brain is trying to keep you alive. Listen to it. I've had that happen in real life. I've had it happen in sim. It always pops up. And if you push through that reptilian brain, that's when people tend to crash and break into people, is because they're ignoring all the warning signs and they're still pushing through it. It's that scary thing. You just have to be in tune to it and listen to it. It'll keep you alive, and it'll keep you. And obviously, we're in sim. You're not going to die if you crash, but you don't want your race to be ended. the reptile part of your brain is going to tell you, don't be in this position. It's scary. You don't want to be here. Listen to it. You'll live to fight another day, and you'll probably end up finishing a lot higher than you would otherwise if you just push through it. So that's my last little feedback on it. I know we're way over time. I knew we were going to be way over time because of just the generalness of Imola and then these changing conditions. But I think it's time well worth spent. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording because it's getting really long. If anybody has any questions whatsoever, I'm going to stick around for a second so we can talk about, if you want to talk about Imola or you want to talk about conditions, we can continue the conversation. But I'm going to go ahead and stop it for those in TV land. Thanks for watching on Twitch. I'll post the replay here soon. So if you want, go practice. I think Pro and Club have their EDE tonight. And then Challenge and Sport will be next Monday. But definitely take advantage of it. Get out there. Try different conditions. Practice is the best way to get better. And with that, I will leave you guys. I'll see you in a couple of weeks, those of you on Twitch. Talk to you later.